Comrade Andre mentioned several times that this is a conversation. World ecology is a community. It is a relentlessly unorthodox and boundary-pushing, boundary-transgressing perspective in the broadest sense of that term. That for me and for many others, we realize that fundamentally new ways of thinking, of representing, of storytelling, of imagining both our past and our present and our possible futures are fundamental. That the thinking that got us into this problem in multiple registers will not deliver us from it. And here we are. So I want to talk about two big things. I'm going to move fast because we want to stick to schedule. So one is, how did we get here? And how does that help us move beyond an ecology of hopelessness? And what is the cultural hegemony of modernity that leads us to be so hopeless? That is, why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism? I want to suggest that the global environmental imaginary that has been with us in its contemporary form since '68 is indeed part of the problem, that this gives us man and nature. But a whole Earth was not discovered in 1968. This was not the first time that powerful men and empires and capitalists had figured out how to imagine the world in this sense of an Earthrise. This is both a product of conquest and an invention of conquest, that one only imagines planetary space in the modern world in order to conquer it and to turn all its life and possibilities into profit-making opportunities. So we are now living through, as we all recognize, the end of the Holocene, that 12,000-year era of relative climate stability. That, of course, is the era of settled agriculture, of cities, and all the rest. So what does it mean? There's a lot of liberal claptrap about the end of the Anthropocene, or the Anthropocene and the end of the Holocene, and I think mostly that points us in a terribly wrong direction. I think that we need to come to grips with the dystopias that are also at the heart of the neoliberal ecotopias of imagining a whole Earth in which we can all consume properly and minimize our carbon footprint and all the rest of the stuff. All of it is premised not just on neoliberal ideas of consumerism, which ends up abstracting and fetishizing a set of relations that are more often and more aptly should be called reproductive work, largely unpaid. But it is also confronting the longer apparatus of bourgeois domination and capitalist rule around man and nature. This is a very crude mapping of the early capitalism in which hardly anyone gets to be part of civilization. And indeed, you can see not the Irish, not the Slavs, not women within Europe, not women everywhere else, of course, and of course plantations in Peru. The indigenous workers were called by their Spanish overlords naturales. They were part of nature, not civilization. In Africa, are full of monsters who could come. They could be workers in the Americas and enjoy the plantations as schools for civilization, as the early 20th century historian U.B. Phillips once called them. So why an ecology of hopelessness rather than hope? Well, one fundamental element of this is the fetish of man and nature, or civilization and nature, and the recurrent structuring of a world around the principles of cheap nature. Cheap in its double register of to reduce in price, but also to cheapen as in to disrespect, to degrade, and to treat without dignity. And so this logic of cheap nature and endless accumulation is one that fuses the planetary class divide, the world color line, and a globalizing patriarchy from year zero of capitalist rule, not when some Englishmen discovered the steam engine, by the way, but rather the invasion of the New World in 1492. And then, of course, we have an ecology of hopelessness in large part because the global environmental imaginary has powerfully evacuated history from its reckoning of the history of class and climate and environmental change over the longue durée. So what begins to happen if we break with man and nature and we shift to a reconstruction of climate history, and not just climate history, in a broadly defined world ecological perspective? What happens if we move from man and nature to civilizations or modes of power and production and reproduction across the longue durée? Well, first of all, it means we get to begin by decolonizing our thinking and these wonderfully evocative and dangerous words of nature, society, European, civilization, savage. All these assume their contemporary meanings in the century or so after 1550. That's not coincidental for many reasons that I'll try to unpack, not least because it was an era of profound climate crisis. We tend to think of the present moment as the first climate crisis that capitalism has experienced. It is not. Indeed, capitalism emerges through an era of profound climate shift, the Little Ice Age, but it achieves its modern form across the long, cold 17th century during the very worst of the Little Ice Age between 1550 and 1700. You can see the nadir of that there. That was in part a capitalogenic process, as I'll talk about in just a moment. But these words were not just words. They were society and nature, civilization and nature, or as the English like to say in Ireland, the struggle between civility, that belonged to Englishmen, and I do mean men, and savagery, which consisted of all the Irish. These were not just words, but they were conceptual hammers of empire and rule and cheap nature. And of course, there were all these other moments of the origins of what's now called fossil capital, which, by the way, doesn't begin in the 18th century. This was the era of the high tide of rebellion and revolt against enclosure in England. But this was also an era of ferocious and genocidal colonialism. Don't worry, we'll get to the Americas in just a moment. Here you can see 1641 on the eve of Cromwell's devastating and genocidal campaigns across Ireland. Most land is held by Catholics, that's in the green. 60 years later, most land is held by Protestant landholders. So this is very much the boundary of civilization and savagery. And by the way, in the West there, that was where cheap labor was extracted for centuries, well into the 20th century. So we have, as ever in the history of capitalism, and showing the lie of critics who would say this is social constructionism, as if we don't construct meanings and relations of power all the time. But we have a dialectic of process and project. That the web of life, of course, is a process of all sorts of unruly natures, from human organizations, labor movements, peasant revolts to the microbiome. But nature, with the capital N, is a project of capital modernity. Nature is an instrument of class struggle. It is the terms over which most class struggle has been waged in one kind or another. If we talk about civil rights movements, for instance, those are struggles for the inclusion of people banished from society to gain access and rights within society. So we're at this moment of what is often reckoned a catastrophic state shift in the global climate system, and that for sure is the case. But how do we think this? So what I like to say is that a state shift in the climate system requires an intellectual state shift, part of which we are all involved in today and over the next couple of days. That means we have to break down the two cultures of the human and natural sciences. We need to break down the divides between the disciplines that serve to discipline unruly intellectuals and to produce serviceable knowledge for the ruling classes. It's an opportunity to move beyond man and nature, society and nature models as if they are billiard balls crashing into one another. An opportunity to move beyond the myth of coupling. We need coupled systems analysis. No, we don't. This is a profound representation of how capital has come to rule the world. We need, rather, drawing on Carolyn Merchant and many others. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize all of this on the chart, but keep in mind this is a flow of flows. Flows of power, of relations of production, relations of reproduction, non-human reproduction, consciousness. All of this is in a flow of flows. Not all moments are created equal, of course, at any moment, but this is crucial. This is one experiment with trying to get beyond the Venn diagrams and the static models of system theorists as we've inherited them from the post-World War II Golden Age. So we're here to do something, to experiment with something around the conversation that we call world ecology. And this might be a little elementary for some, but I think it bears repeating that capitalism is itself part of the web of life, and that it emerges through environments of humans and the rest of nature's environments of humans and the rest of nature that are often quite resistive, quite unhappy with what capital and empire is trying to do. And so it's worth understanding in that simple term that capitalism makes environments, and those environments make capitalism, and you can break that down into its component moments as you wish. So we have a grand problem in radical thought, which is how do we deal with climate history? And Mike Davis aside, we don't have that many Marxist or other histories, radical histories of climate change, historical climate change. We have lots of accounts of what drives the process. We have lots of accounts of how capitalism and climate are entangling and unfolding in the present moment. But we don't have much in the way of a longue durée point of view. And that's a problem because we then cede the terrain to neo-Malthusian imaginaries, which I'll touch on in the second part of this talk. We cede the terrain to people like Jared Diamond and the collapse narrative, which is not only largely false, but largely dangerous in a political sense, and I think feeds a kind of emergency politics that is readily appropriable by the populist right. What happens if we look at, over the past 2,000 years, major climate shifts in the northern hemisphere? These are two proxies. The one on the top is relates to solar minima and maxima, so that is the amount of solar radiation and energy heating up the Earth. And then at the bottom, volcanic eruptions. So we can all hope for volcanic eruptions to slow down climate change. Who knows? They played a big role in history before, as we'll see. But one of the upshots of this, don't worry, there won't be an exam on all this, but you can see that every time there's a major downturn, that is a major shift towards colder climates in the northern hemisphere, you have powerful moments of crisis. You have Rome's 3rd century crisis with the end of what's called the Roman climate optimum. You have the barbarian invasions from 376 that come in during the worst Eurasian drought in 2,000 years. You have the followed by the Dark Ages cold period and the late antique Little Ice Age, during which Roman power in the West totally collapses. And guess what? That's not such a bad thing. Turns out when the empires go, everybody else lives a little bit better. So let's keep that in mind in the present moment. So one of the lessons to this, and I'll keep harping on this for the next few minutes, is that moments of really significant downturns in the climate, and that's meant colder for the past 2,000 years. Obviously that means warmer today. But those are moments of political possibility. And so let's just keep that in our minds as we walk through this. One of the ways to conceptualize these major shifts, the crisis of Roman power in the West, the crisis of feudal power in the 14th century, is precisely through this model earlier. I'm not saying we need to adopt this wholeheartedly, but this is Carolyn Merchant's rather perceptive model in which conditions of life, production, reproduction, power, consciousness all feed into each other. So what this means is that climate is not this exogenous factor in modes of production or civilizations, pick your favorite phrase. That climate is woven into the fabric of civilizational systems of power and production and reproduction. And once we begin to put it in these terms, it allows us to unthink man and nature, to understand that yes, there is a powerful geophysical moment, but the geophysical moment is so partial that we have to be able to situate it within relations of power and production and reproduction. So this starts to get us in the direction of not man and nature, but climate class conjunctures and climate class configurations. class broadly conceived here. So this allows us to do something with Marx that isn't usually taken very seriously. And many of you are familiar with this passage. He opens the chapter on the labor process and capital with it. And it's so powerful for me because what he points out is that through the process of work, that the worker not only transforms himself, herself, but transforms external nature and transforms the relations of production simultaneously. So there's this triple transformation that is at its heart a relational transformation. It is a transformation of the flow of flows. And if we take that seriously, then so too for modes of production. Civilizations transform their environments, and in so doing are radically transformed. There's no greater and clearer case of this than the climate crisis in the 21st century. So what about the Anthropocene? People think I hate the Anthropocene. So there's a good Anthropocene and a bad one. The good one is the Earth System Science version. Okay, so what do they say? They say the three great markers in the stratigraphic layer, atomic residues from atomic testing, chicken bones, plastics. That's what capitalism will be known for millions of years from now. So make of that what you will. But then there's a slippage. So and the Earth System scientists are as guilty of this as the social scientists and the folks in the humanities. And I say, well, we're now in the Anthropocene, the age of man. It's man versus nature. We're all responsible for the climate crisis and all that good stuff. So this is the popular Anthropocene. It's not the geological Anthropocene, but the popular one. And this reveals the ongoing bankruptcy of the environmental imaginary as we've had it since 1968. And of course, at the core, as many people have pointed out, is that climate change is not anthropogenic, it's capitalogenic. And even the figures for China are dramatically, are true enough, but most of that is driven by foreign direct investment and imports from the United States and the EU. So you can get a sense of just how wildly uneven these processes of capitalogenic climate change have been. And so this goes back to an older model that I teased before in The Rise of Capitalism, that we have a divide of civilization and nature, in which most human beings are not in civilization. So when the Anthropocene folks want to say, well, it's humans and nature, they're ignoring that historically most human beings have been evicted from their place in humanity. And that's something that we have to come to terms with, especially given the rather dark history of modern environmentalism around questions of race, migration, population, and all the rest. So the popular Anthropocene feeds this kind of ecology of hopelessness, which is ultimately, that the only solutions will be engineering, technical and engineering solutions. That's not to say that engineering solutions are unnecessary, but to have a politics that is framed around it and is framed around the wholesale skepticism that democratic action of any kind can be useful, that's going to cause a lot of hopelessness and feed the sense that nothing can be done. So this is something that we can continue to play with, how global environmental imaginaries have disabled radical responses to the climate crisis as we move on. And one thing that World-Ecology would point out is that we can move beyond the carbon reductionism of parts per million. It's more than just that. Yes, that's a big part of it, but it's not the whole story. It takes a geophysical moment and moves it into the geohistorical. It says that the parts per million problem of CO2, whatever we're at now, 410, 415, onward and upward, is fundamentally, ontologically, historically linked to the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, and climate apartheid. So that's a very different line, even from the eco-socialist position this time, which seems to have devolved into a kind of popular frontism that leads nowhere. So what's the upshot here so far? Unfavorable climate shifts are bad for ruling classes. Yes, the 99% in any given era suffer, but the political power of the ruling classes tends to come into question in fairly massive ways. Now, as I mentioned, this is true from 376, the end of the Roman climate optimum. That's how favorable Rome's climate was. and the great barbarian invasions that destabilized political power in Western and Central Europe. This is, of course, a complicated story that involves more than the migration peoples, but it bears attention in an era of climate crisis and world migration today. The next 5 centuries or so in Europe calibrate to a very, in a very interesting way to the collapse of Roman power and the reassertion of a peasant mode of production across what's called the Dark Ages cold period. So interestingly enough, even though the climate was enormously cold and unfavorable for Roman power and for the great estates of the great villas of Roman civilization in the West, peasants responded, as they often do, in creative ways, with shifted towards a new fertility regime, so lower birth rates. The children from environmental and other archaeologists are now finding out that health was better, people grew taller. There was a kind of golden age in the standards of living for peasants across this era. And so you can see in a very crude way that even though the late antique Little Ice Age here, that Lollia mark in the middle, is extremely cold and unfavorable in many respects for those who lived in Western Europe. The peasants reestablished villages after the long interregnum of Roman slave latifundia. They reestablished they established a new demography